Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I live here in Berkshire County, and there are fairly few opportunities here in the Berkshires to talk about my work, and so I'm pleased to have one and honored to be here as your guest. I've met a few of you before, and I look forward to talking to you guys later over lunch. So what I thought I would do is talk for a little bit about my research, start with my this is very current stuff. Maybe for about 45 minutes, take a few minutes for questions, and then I asked if I could also give a short introduction to INET, the institution that I work for. We have in particular some programs that might be of interest to the summer fellows, visiting summer fellows, and also some research interests that might be of interest to your permanent research staff. So I thought that I might talk about those things for a little bit, and just as a kind of a way of introducing INET's work and what I do for INET. Fine, so let me start with this. This is ongoing research on, narrowly speaking, on the internationalization of the Chinese currency, the renminbi. I was not entirely certain of what level to be talking to you guys at. So I've got some slides of sort of general purpose, and I will try to adapt it to your guys' interests and sort of current state of knowledge. I may not be able to get all the way to the most detailed conclusions, but hopefully I can give you a sense of where we are and the way that we're going with this research. I'm happy to take questions as we go, so it would actually be helpful for me to know if I lose you, and questions are a good way to do that. So the Chinese financial system is something that's of interest, and I think that doesn't require a whole lot of additional justification, but let me give you a specific way of looking at what I see going on in the Chinese financial system that kind of motivates this work and some of INET's other work on China. China's financial system, the Chinese economy has been characterized recently by what I would call imbalanced growth, certainly compared to rich countries, but even compared to other developing countries. China has extremely high investment, high level of investment, and very low level of household consumption. So this means that a lot of the incomes being earned in the Chinese economy are accruing not to households, and not to households where it could fund consumption, but instead to producers of investment goods. And so the consequence of this is that in a country with a huge level of poverty, lots of money is getting spent on building more machines and more productive capacity rather than on raising the standard of living of the average Chinese citizen, who is, statistically speaking, very poor. Yeah.
So is the logic embedded in that most poor families make incomes that are contingent on consumption rather than on investment?
So the logic is that I guess I would say, maybe I wasn't completely clear, that the low consumption is to some extent a symptom of the high investment. So high investment is driven by policy, and low consumption is a symptom of that. But it is true that most Chinese households are in sectors which are targeted towards consumption. So their incomes are also would also be affected by that same imbalance.
Yeah. Can you repeat the question, please? Because you have to remember you got a microphone on and the speaker.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. I will repeat the questions. So related is that China's growth, which has been impressive, averaging 8% over recent years, averaging 10% over the last couple of decades, is impressive, and there's no question about that. What is also true, however, is that it's come with in order to achieve that level of growth, China has had to invest in producing a large amount of physical capital. So that's not inherently bad. Capital increases productivity. That's not a bad thing by any means. But China is a labor-rich country with lots of people, a very large labor force, and most of them are pretty poor. And so compared to most other developing countries, China has a lot of capital for such poor people. The question is whether the investment is in fact sustainable. Will you be able to generate enough incomes, using that capital, generate enough incomes to pay for the capital? Because in the end, the investment in capital is not economic if it never produces the income needed to pay for itself. You would have been better off not investing in the capital. China's banking system is full of loans that are not likely to ever be paid back. So the large commercial banks with heavy involvement from the state have finances which are questionable at best. They can carry on doing what they're doing, but at some point they're going to have to reckon with the fact that a lot of loans have been made that have no realistic prospect of being repaid. There's a thing called the shadow banking system in China, which is providing credit without the commercial banking system, but this is dodgy at best, and there too the finances are fragile. The investments of the shadow banks are of questionable quality, and if those loans are not repaid, then the depositors into that system are likely to make significant losses. And that has started a little bit in the last year or so. It's not yet clear how bad that could get, but it doesn't look good. If you look at the public finances of Chinese government at various levels, you see that there's a huge amount of debt incurred at the local government level, and really in the trillions of dollars. And the local governments are tightly wound up with the next thing: local property development, local infrastructure development. Again, these are again capital investments of somewhat questionable quality. So there's a lot of debt in the shadow banking system at the local government level associated with property, in the commercial banking system associated with infrastructure and export development, which all of these debt accumulations are consequences of the way that China has grown, and things look fragile in a number of ways. So one could say a lot more about the details of this. From my point of view, this is a starting point. These are problems in the system which are fairly apparent and which need some work. Michael Pettis, China financial analyst, wrote a book on this in 2013, which is a decent reference point. So let me say a little bit. It's a bit of a jump, but I have to get a little bit toward the specifics here. So one of the main characteristics of Chinese economic policy has been an exchange rate policy, which is essentially to keep to depress. Or this is over decades. That policy seems to be in flux now. To depress the value to depress the price of Chinese currency vis-a-vis the dollar to support Chinese exporters. And the basic way let me just walk you through. This is a series of transactions. Let me walk you through the way it works. Each one of these represents a balance sheet with the asset side on the left and the liability side on the right. The underlying process that's going on here is that an importer somewhere outside of China is buying goods from a Chinese exporter. The importer is paying in dollars, and that piece of the transaction represents the importer paying out in dollars. The exporter is ultimately receiving payment in CNY, domestic Chinese currency, Chinese yuan. So this is the thing that needs to happen. The importer buys in dollars and the exporter receives the payment in domestic currency. And the question that this diagram is answering is, what are the mechanics by which that actually happens? More or less, what happens is a transfer of funds. The dollars flow out of the importer into a Chinese bank onshore, which creates a dollar to the credit of the exporter. The onshore bank immediately surrenders those dollars to the central bank, who buys them here and creates new domestic currency reserves to the credit of the bank. The bank then uses those domestic currency reserves to create a deposit to the credit of the exporter. So the end result of all this is that the importer gives up its dollars, the banking system combined with the central bank absorb those dollars and convert them into domestic currency reserves. The bank creates the deposit liability to the credit of the export. All well and good. So what we can conclude from this is that China, which has run an export surplus most years over the period of its rapid growth, in the presence of an exchange rate policy, a policy of keeping the exchange rate low, the consequence of this is here. The consequence of this for the central bank is a huge accumulation of dollar reserves at the central bank and a huge creation of domestic money in the form of currency reserves. Yeah.
What's the percentage of GDP?
So the question is, what is the percentage of GDP? What percentage of GDP are currency reserves at? If I recall correctly, Chinese GDP is around $14 trillion per year, and currency reserves are at about $4 trillion per year. So it's a little more than a third, 30, 35, 36%, something. Is there another question?
Yeah. For the People's Bank of China, it creates the Chinese yuan to absorb the US dollar. So this is actually how they issue currency in Chinese yuan. Is that true?
This is one of the, so the question is this process how money is issued by the central bank into the Chinese economy? And the short answer is yes, this is one of the basic ways that the central bank has created domestic money. So one theoretical perspective would lead you from this to worry that this would generate inflation, which has been a concern of the central bank. And there are other transactions which they do after this to try to reduce the potential inflationary impact of money creation. I'm not focused on that here. So the basic message here, if you wanna summarize, abstract away from the details, the basic message is that the Chinese economy has been characterized by a large one-way flow of payments, money coming from outside of China into China to pay for Chinese exports. The consequence of that one-way flow over many years has been a large position accumulated at the central bank in the form of currency reserves. Here's a graphical representation. Basically, we're looking at the same thing here, right? The current account balance in blue, positive current account balance, you can basically think of that as a trade surplus, Chinese trade surplus, and it goes all the way back to the beginning here in 1998 and has gotten very big, maybe a little bit smaller now, but this would still be big. This would still be big by historical standards, and it reached its peak in the late 2000s. So large inflows on current account, large inflows to pay for Chinese exports have been met by large reserve accumulations at the central bank. And so the reserve assets in green are these right here, these dollars. So the Chinese central bank is absorbing the dollars coming in to pay for Chinese exports. This is unprecedented, okay, this particular state of affairs, that China would have accumulated $4 trillion in foreign currency reserves over less than 20 years has no real historical parallel.
Question?
Yeah.
So those green parts are annual, meaning the change in reserve assets, not the stock.
Yeah. These are flows. These are flows, not stocks. So these are billions of dollars here. So you could say in these peak years, inflow during the quarter. Is that possible? I think that must be right. During the quarter, it reached 200 billion. Yeah. these are very large numbers. So into this mix, okay, so we have a fragile financial system, we have a macroeconomy based on significantly unbalanced flows. Into this situation, we introduce a fairly narrow question, a question narrow enough to do some research on, the internationalization of the Chinese currency. And so there's some facts here that create the perspective we want to start with. The People's Bank has signed swap agreements with many central banks, most of them in sort of out-of-the-way places, but in 2013, they signed agreements with the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, not out-of-the-way places at all. The swap lines are standing agreements which can be activated when needed to provide Chinese currency to banking systems in countries outside of China. So for example, China could provide renminbi to European banks or to British banks through the central banks of those currency areas through a direct agreement between the People's Bank, the Chinese Central Bank, and the ECB, or the Bank of England. So it seems that the Chinese authorities and also the officials at these institutions are imagining a potential role for the Chinese currency outside of China, in which the European banking system or the British banking system could have need for Chinese currency. So China is the world's largest trading nation, and it turns out that between 2010 and 2013, the role of the Chinese currency in settling Chinese trade, both imports and exports, has dramatically increased from 3% of total trade to 11% in just 3 years. That trade number is a huge number, so we're talking about a pretty sizable shift. So again, evidence that the potential role for the Chinese currency outside of China is large and potentially growing. And offshore offshore holdings of RMB have reached 1 trillion RMB. It's more or less 6 to 1 to the dollar, so $150 billion offshore by the end of 2012, which was the latest number I had. So these deposits are accumulating offshore and reaching sizable numbers. So this leads to a big question, which is, right now the world financial system is based on the dollar. Could we imagine a future in which the Chinese currency serves that role, displacing the dollar? I'm not going to attempt to answer that question, not today and not in our paper. But there are a lot of smaller questions which follow from that, which I think are within the scope. As for the big question, I think it's hard to say, and there are, as we'll see, there's a lot of potential complicating factors. Too much for one paper to answer. But there are a lot of relevant small questions which play into that. Your question.
Fragile usually means bank failures, but that's not what you mean, I don't think. So I don't know what you mean by fragile.
So I said earlier that the Chinese financial system, I think, is fragile. That's what you're referring to. Yeah. So I think the Chinese financial system is fragile because how does the financial system work? It takes deposits. How does the financial system work? Basically, in China, it takes deposits from households for the most part and makes loans to companies for the most part. A lot of those loans are not likely to be paid back, either because they've gone to support property development, to build offices and apartments which are never going to be sold or rented, to fund investment in capital equipment, which is never going to generate enough sales to pay back the loan, and funds to local governments which don't have any tax base, funding to local governments which don't have enough tax base to generate income to pay back the loans. So credit has been extended, loans have been made through the system, which are not supporting economic activity, which can return the money to the ultimate lenders. The ultimate lenders are Chinese households who happen to be in a decidedly marginal position in this system. And so I would call it fragile in the sense that absent policy intervention, eventually somebody's going to run out of money to pay this back. Now, it's a big country. They have a lot of money. They could push this day of reckoning off into the future, maybe a long way into the future. But I think it's not hard to argue that there's a certain fragility in this system. There are some existing perspectives on this question, on the internationalization of the RMB, and so let me quickly summarize. A domestic perspective common to Chinese observers is to say, well, China is the world's largest trading nation, probably within 20 years could be the largest economy in the world. Big countries have international currencies, therefore China's currency will be international. I'm simplifying a little bit, but this is more or less the logic. To say that China is big, China's involved very heavily with international trade, and its currency will find international use. There's an international perspective typical of financial markets participants who would say that a currency finds international use when there are deep and liquid financial markets in that currency, like the US dollar has, securities markets, borrowing and lending, short-term and long-term, treasury debt, corporate debt, everything. And internationalization depends on an open capital account, on it being easy to move money in and out of the country, put a deposit into the US, take a deposit out of the US. That's easy. Put a deposit into China, take a deposit out of China. Those things are very, very difficult. The conclusion is that it will be difficult for the renminbi to reach a state where it sees wide international use. And I think that both of these perspectives are unhelpful, specifically because neither one makes any reference to exactly how internationalization is supposed to work. Chinese policymakers have confounded international observers for a long time by making things work and by making growth carry on at high levels. Maybe that's unsustainable, and there's reason to think that there have been negative consequences to that, but all the same, there have been ways to keep things going. In this case, to understand whether the RMB will reach international use, we need to know something about exactly what is meant by internationalization, exactly how it's supposed to work, and then maybe we'll be in a better position to evaluate whether this could actually happen. So over the next 2 slides, let me lay out a little bit of a different perspective. So for 2 slides, I'm going to step away from China and talk about monetary economics more generally. This provides the perspective that we use in the paper, okay, so I'm just warning you that I'm going to step away from China, and I don't want you to think that I've lost track of what I'm talking about. So this is at a very, very general level now. So I think that for talking about this issue, we need a different perspective, and I think we have the perspective that we need. So this is a view which has been called by my former advisor and now colleague Perry Merriling, called the money view. Derives very strongly from economic thinking of the 19th and 20th century, but all of these authors here are, for the most part, neglected by standard economic theory and sort of not built into the perspectives which most economists come to these issues with. So it's called the money view as an alternative to the economics view on the one hand, which thinks about capital accumulation, but also as an alternative to the finance view, which thinks about flows of dividends, discounted flows of dividends. This is the money view, which thinks about payment, about settlement. So what are the characteristics of this view? Morris Copeland in 1952 did a study, 6 or 7 year study on money flows in the U.S. economy, and the objective was it was supposed to be an alternative to the national account, so an alternative to GDP accounting, but also an alternative to the flow of funds accounts, and in fact one that would connect the two. So it would provide a perspective which tightly integrated real economic activity and financial activity into a single set of accounts. And he basically showed that it was possible And he did it for 6 years with a team of statisticians and researchers. And that tradition was essentially lost, and we don't have. It was never embedded into a statistical gathering process, and so as a result, it's a great idea, but the statistics he imagined are ones that we don't have. The fundamental observation from that perspective, I would say, is that we can think of everyone as a bank. Everyone in the economy is kind of like a little bank, matching funds coming in with funds going out, and trying to make those things work out favorably. What do we mean by favorably? Well, Hyman Minsky, particularly his very first stuff in the late 50s and early 60s, had an answer, which was that in a financial economy, the thing that really, the constraint that binds first is the ability to make your payments at the end of the day. So debts come due, and when they come due, on the day that they come due, they need to be paid. Money's coming in from income or from dividends, wage income, wherever, and those funds provide us. Those sources provide the funds to meet the obligations that are coming due on the same day. If they fall short, then the survival constraint is binding, and you need to find a way to pay your debts. If you don't, you can be taken to court. And so the financial system, the first function of the financial system, is to provide a way to get you to the next day, right? By making a short-term loan to make up for the shortfall of your cash inflows relative to the cash commitments, to the bills that you have to pay on that day. So there's a survival constraint and a financial system which exists to loosen the survival constraint. Let me skip to number 5 for a second, because when the survival constraint binds for one person, then a bank can help them. And when the survival constraint binds for a bank, then another bank might be able to help them. But when the survival constraint binds for everybody at the same time, when the entire economy is not generating enough cash to pay all of its commitments, then there's no private sector. At that point, there's no private sector intervention which can solve the problem, and you need to have someone in the public sector who can do it. The central bank has a unique position in its ability to create money at the stroke of a pen, and so it can serve as the lender of last resort to the financial system. Walter Bagehot's Lombard Street is sort of the classic source for that, but a number of other authors have pushed that idea forward and tried to update it for modern institutions. Two other elements of this perspective: the inherent instability of credit. So Hawtrey, writing a book called Currency and Credit in 1919 and an essay called The Art of Central Banking in 1932, observed that the financial system has a tendency to amplify on the way up and also amplify on the way down, to increase the size of growth, of positive developments in the economy, and to amplify crashes and contractions. One way to see it is to say that if you want to borrow to pay for something, so let's say you want to borrow to pay for a house, the availability of credit to pay for the house makes it easier to buy the house, and therefore has a tendency to push the price up. But the value of the house, the asset, also creates collateral for lending, and so as its value rises, your capacity to borrow against it also rises. And so this the collateralized credit has a tendency to amplify price bubbles and price swings, which should still be very familiar to all of us from recent years, where so-called innovations in mortgage finance made it easier for people to buy houses, drove prices up, made it still easier for credit to be extended, and so on, until a limit of some kind was reached. Same on the way down. As prices fall, it becomes harder to borrow, meaning that you have to repay your loans. To repay your loans, you have to sell the collateral, pushes the price down, pushes the lending down, price down. So credit has an inherent tendency to amplify both upswings and downswings. This is not good. Even if you think that lending is overdone, in general, a rapid adjustment, a crisis, is not desirable. Smooth adjustments would almost certainly be better. And so the private credit system the tendency of the private credit system to amplify upswings and downswings is unhelpful and needs to be resisted. And that's what Hartree wrote about. And the central bank, again, has a particular role in doing that. And the last element of this perspective is the dealer function. Why do prices exist? Prices exist because someone is willing to sell you something at them. Who is it that sells you? Who is it that does that? Who is it that makes a price available? In the financial markets, those people are dealers, securities dealers in particular. And they exist in order to transact, in order to buy and sell. You can think about securities dealers. At any point in the day, they'll give you a buy price and a sell price, and the ability to quickly transact at those prices. And the economics of serving as a dealer are interesting and tell us something about the role of liquidity and the intersection between the role of liquidity in the financial system and the intersection between short-term finance and prices in securities markets. I'll say a little bit more about the dealer function. There's actually a lot to be said about all of these things. A lot to be said about all of these things, which I won't really have time to get into now, but I can give you things to read on them if you like. From this perspective, though, we can draw a couple of very basic conclusions about how to think about a monetary economy. Because the essence of this is payments, right? Is everyone acting as a bank, meeting their cash commitments with whatever cash they can generate. So in order to understand a monetary economy, we need to understand its payment system. In order to understand the international monetary system, we need to understand the mechanics of international payments. In order to understand the Chinese monetary system, we need to understand the Chinese payment system, the role of banks in that system, the role of the central bank in that system. Because it's the survival constraint, which is the first thing that binds when things go wrong, either for an isolated institution or for a sector or a group of institutions. The availability of short-term credit, overnight credit, or one-week credit, or one-month credit maybe, these are the things that ease that survival constraint, that make it possible for short-term mismatches of funds to be smoothed over, at least for a short period. So understanding the operation of short-term borrowing and lending markets is a way to understand how well that system is working. And when there are stresses in short-term money markets, then there's some indication that things are going wrong. And the central bank, as the institution most able to quickly create credit, to quickly smooth the survival constraint, or help institutions avoid the survival constraint, is a central institution to understand in the operation of this system. So that's first slide. Second slide on this perspective is about the prices of money. So money comes in a lot of different forms: banknotes, central bank money, bank deposits, and so on. And these things can be converted between each other. If you can exchange something for another thing, then there's a price. And so it's possible to identify what I see as 5 key prices of money. Very quickly, state money. So why don't you think about green pieces of paper versus bank money, bank deposits, and I call the price par. This price is normally 1 in a reasonably functioning monetary economy. If you take funds out of your wallet and deposit them in your bank, you get an exchange between those 2 forms of money, one for one. But remember, and it's so mechanical that you don't ever really think about it, but remember that it is not necessarily the case that always has to be true. For that to work, it relies on the proper functioning of a large institutional apparatus, which makes it so. Likewise, money onshore versus money offshore, this is mostly relevant at a sort of commercial level, but your dollars in the United States versus dollars in Europe, what is the price of moving money in dollars, not changing currency, moving money from from onshore to offshore for commercial transactions. And this price is also usually pretty close to 1, less maybe some transactions fees. If you move money offshore and also change currency, then you can think about the price of domestic money versus foreign money, which we're more familiar with, the exchange rate. And so the first three are converting money between its sort of different institutional forms: onshore, public money, private money, onshore money, offshore money, and money here versus money abroad. And then it's also possible to move money in time, and we normally think of this, as the rate of interest. And I think about it in two, money today versus money tomorrow. So here I'm thinking of the survival constraint. I'm going to have money tomorrow, how can I move it back to today? And the answer is that someone will lend it to me overnight, and I'll pay it back tomorrow. The price at which you do that is the short-term rate of interest. Thinking more about capital, I have an investment that I'm going to make today, and in 10 years that'll generate funds. So how do I move money from 10 years in the future to today? Basically the same thing, but it's at the long-term rate of interest, which in general is different from the overnight rate of interest. These are all prices of one kind of money for another kind of money, and these prices exist because somebody is exchanging one for the other. So banks will convert your state money into bank money and back, and there's an institutional apparatus, as I said, to support that exchange at a price of 1. There are foreign exchange dealers to move your money abroad. There are short-term loans available to move your money from tomorrow to today, or from 10 years from now to today. And so and the institutions which provide that service are doing it because they can earn a profit by doing so. Back to China. So China has established an institutional system for internationalizing its currency, which basically involves the creation of an offshore version of its currency called CNH. CNY is the onshore, CNH is the offshore, H is for Hong Kong, which is where most of this happens. So I said I wanted to look at the prices of money. So here what I want to do is look at the price of onshore money versus the price of offshore money in the Chinese system. This is an exchange rate, and so down is more valuable relative to the dollar. So from mid-2011 to the beginning of 2014 is a period of appreciation of the renminbi against the dollar. And the first thing to observe is that to a first approximation, these two lines move together, that offshore money and offshore money are very clearly are following the same trend, and the spread between them is pretty constant. And so to a first approximation, these two things are very similar. So second, when does the pattern change? And essentially you can observe two periods where the change is quite dramatic. This is late 2010, like September of 2010 more or less, where the offshore money, the green line, Hong Kong renminbi, becomes significantly more valuable relative to onshore money than was otherwise the norm. And the reverse, which happens in late 2011, where onshore, let's say offshore money becomes significantly less valuable relative to the norm, less valuable than onshore money relative to the norm. Since then, the two lines have basically moved together, and the spread between them has basically been constant. So what can we conclude? So Hong Kong, I guess to connect this to the broad perspective, Hong Kong money, Hong Kong renminbi, is kind of the first step offshore for the Chinese currency, right? Chinese currency exists within the Chinese borders, and Hong Kong is its sort of first step offshore, right? The Chinese financial system is very tightly integrated into the world financial system, but also tightly integrated into the Chinese economy. So Hong Kong is a logical place for the sort of offshore journey of the renminbi to begin. So my perspective leads me to say, well, what is the price of that movement? And so the answer is that price is very small when there's enough liquidity. What you, by looking closely at these two episodes, what you see is that the institutions which serve the purpose of moving money from onshore to offshore and back were strained at those 2 points in time, and there was inadequate liquidity provided by the official institutions involved, by the Central Bank of China and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Central Bank of Hong Kong, and that caused the price to widen. So if they're serious about internationalization, right, and they want those prices, the difference between the prices to be small and constant, and not to have big spikes like those, then liquidity to the system will need to be always available. What constrained liquidity is excessive flows in one direction or another, and that's what characterized the 2010 and 2011 episodes. And since then, it seems like they've gotten things a little bit more under control, and I don't think I have time to get into this, but essentially one of the mechanisms is an agreement between the two central banks to provide liquidity when it's needed. Yeah. Oh, 5 minutes, yep. I think I'm going to be good. So quickly, this is short, 3 month, more or less, 3 month interest rates. Blue is offshore in Hong Kong in renminbi, offshore in blue, onshore in red. The conclusion to draw is that aside from a couple moments when these two interest rates were very close, in general there is a wide gap between them. It is much cheaper to borrow in renminbi offshore than it is to borrow in renminbi onshore. There's a relationship called covered interest parity, which connects exchange rates with interest rates. And so if you had a forward exchange market, it would be able to absorb this significant differential between interest rates. But if the Chinese central bank is committed to holding this price of onshore and offshore money constant and equal to one, then this difference in interest rates is not going to be sustainable. So if you're offshore, if you can borrow cheaply in offshore renminbi and lend at a great profit in onshore renminbi, and the price of converting between offshore and onshore is 1, then you can make a lot of money by borrowing in Hong Kong and lending onshore. And people are trying to do this already. This would strain the system if they attempted to make it permanent and institutionalized and long term. And if you read the news, you learn about all these sort of interesting ways to exploit little holes in the system. Copper financing is a way essentially to move money, disguise a capital account transaction, a borrowing or a lending transaction as a current account transaction, because copper is something that looks like it's used for trade. Without getting into the details, there are gaps in the sort of border of the system which let money in and out and sort of keep prices from sorting out these unbalanced flows. I won't attempt to explain this in detail. This is a schematic representation of the operation of a dealer. So we're thinking of the People's Bank of China as kind of a dealer in financial markets. And essentially the message here is that as the market pushes the price of onshore money up, then the People's Bank is required to expand its balance sheet in order to resist that. And I can give you a reference if you want to understand this. This is a very helpful way of thinking about what's going on, but it requires 20 or 25 minutes to explain it, so I won't try to do that. But let me show you this, which is the same thing a little bit more empirically. This is the price of onshore money against the dollar. The People's Bank announces a trading band, okay, which is the shaded area, and then the actual exchange rate is the daily exchange rate is the darker line inside there, all normalized to be centered on 0, right? So this is, remember that on the graph we saw before, this whole thing is actually appreciating over this, at least over this period, it's appreciating. So we're sort of flattening out the trend and then asking what happens in between. And so I just want to call your attention here, which says, in this period, which is one of appreciation, right? the People's Bank is every day announcing a center point and announcing a 1% plus or minus 1% band, and every day the private market is pushing the rate all the way up against the band, right? And then they move the band a little bit, and the same thing happens the next. So what in terms of this, what it's saying is that every day the market is pushing up against this edge, and the central bank has to move a little bit. So the question, which we try to get into in the paper, is how does introducing an offshore version of the currency into this system change the Chinese central bank's ability to affect the currency and therefore to carry out its macroeconomic strategy. Let me leave that. And this is the last one. So this is, I've been talking in a pretty detailed way about the Chinese monetary system, about Chinese financial system. What is this, can we step back a little bit and draw some big conclusions? Not answers to the big question I posed at the beginning, but questions at kind of a high level. To make the prices work, you can't just let the currency move back and forth. You also need to let financial flows go back and forth. And so with this, I agree with the international view, at least to some extent on internationalization, that you'll have to open the capital account to some extent. You'll have to allow some kind of money flows between onshore and offshore in order to absorb the flows between onshore and offshore. You'll need a private system to do that. The perspective of the payment system is useful because you can start from an individual transaction, which I did at the beginning, and get all the way up to the balance of payments view of the entire economy. And so it's sort of only there that you can understand exactly how trade flows lead to $4 trillion foreign exchange position. And in the paper, we also try to get at some of these financial stability issues for China about the shadow banking system and the commercial banking system and what role they play in all of this. So this is the end of the talk. I have given you a lot. I'm happy to take questions at a detailed or less detailed level. I'm happy to talk about anything. This is what I'm working on. And it pulls out a very specific piece of the question, but one that's tied in very tightly to issues which are much broader, maybe of more general interest, but a little harder to actually focus one's research. So thank you for that. And I guess maybe we'll take questions for a little while, and when we run out of questions, I'll talk about INET. Does that sound good? Yeah, please.
We use the Hong Kong as the case to study the onshore or offshore between the Hong Kong market and the China mainland. And your conclusion is the focal point of the interest rate risk is the major driver. But if we think about the international trade between China and the US, in the past, only like 1% or even less than 1% of international trade between those two countries are paid in renminbi. But now, I just read an article this morning from the Wall Street Journal, now the percentage is 17%. Just within the past month, the percentage is increased from 1% to 17%. So do you think the major driver of this offshore or onshore imbalance between those two countries are contributed by exchange rates, not interest rates? Because Chinese companies, they are worried about this exchange rates because this exchange between the Chinese yuan and the US dollar has been so fluctuation. So they prefer to take yuan instead of the US dollar.
Sure. Yeah, so let me, for the record here, let me try to characterize your question. You're pointing out the difference between exchange rate risk and interest rate risk as two sources for impetus, right? Pressures for internationalization. I would add to that you've also highlighted a difference between trade flows and capital flows to some extent, which I think is also relevant. So it's certainly true. It's certainly true that the renminbi invoicing of trade is increasing. And it's certainly true that historically, exchange rate policy has played a big role in China's international economic policy. My question is, and I think what the payment perspective leads you to ask is, what happens to those? What happens to that money after it flows in or out of the country, right? That for example, when you run a surplus for many decades, a trade surplus for many decades, it accumulates as a balance, right? As a bank deposit. And unless you buy, unless China starts buying significant exports from the United States, those dollars aren't going to go anywhere. So that's one observation. Second observation is that the gross flows, right? So if you look at the trade flow, that's a net flow. It's exports minus imports, right? And so the difference is the trade balance. But all the exports and all the imports have to get paid for, and so the gross flows are considerably bigger than the net flows. So who's paying for all of those gross flows? Somebody has to come up with the funds to pay for all of the exports and all of the imports involved with Chinese trade. The way that operates institutionally is through the provision of a large amount of credit, so that goods which have been produced but not yet sold can be bought and sold, can be moved through the production and distribution systems, and so there's a lot of credit which supports this ultimate net trade flow. So I think first of all, conclusions. First of all, you can't separate, I don't think, exchange rate from interest rate flows. It's very, very difficult to what China's trying to do now, for example, is to have an open trade account and a closed capital account, right? So you can buy and sell goods, but you can't move money. And that's nearly impossible, as they're discovering. If the possibility for money to move in or out is through trade is open, then people will find a way to move money in and out for financial purposes as well. So from that, you can conclude that the exchange rate and the interest rate are also not separable. If there's a big interest rate gap, okay, as there currently is between Hong Kong and mainland, then people will find a way to move money in to borrow at the cheap interest rate and lend at the expensive interest rate and try to make a profit.
So related to that, I guess maybe I'm asking this question because I don't know a lot about the institutions.
Yep.
You were talking about people trying to make profits off of the spread between the Hong Kong and mainland China interest rates. Why isn't the gap converging to zero?
Right. So we saw in the graph that so the question is, there's a large and persistent gap which creates the opportunity for an arbitrage profit, and people are trying to take advantage of it. So you might say, well, how come the prices don't move to eliminate that advantage? If people are making free money from this, then you would expect the financial system to adjust prices until the arbitrage goes away. That's a standard observation in finance theory, and it's basically true. So something must be preventing the prices from fully adjusting. And I guess my read of that, I don't think there's a definitive answer to that question. My read is that China's capital controls are not perfect, but they have an effect. And I would say that the ability to keep this spread at 2 points or 1.5 points is an indication that the capital controls do work. It's not trivial to take advantage. It's not trivial to take advantage of this spread. And so in order to do it, you have to have access to certain institutions. You probably have to have a good amount of money to start with. You have to be willing to take some risk, legal risk, various things. So I think capital controls are successfully keeping those things apart. However, where was it? Here. If you look at these various mechanisms that people have come up with to move money back and forth, you see that it's a lot, right? There's a lot of this activity is going on. So it's kind of at a middle ground where it's enough to be economically significant. The amount of this copper financing is definitely into the billions. No one can tell me how big Nabal Wide Eye is. It's a way of another sort of quasi-legal way of moving money onshore and offshore. Over and under invoicing, I mean, people are saying that that's big enough to have an effect, a significant, economically significant effect on the trade balance. So large numbers, but not enough to completely cause the prices to converge. So that's unfortunately probably the best answer I can give.
Other question?
Yeah. Back.
And there's shadow banking.
Yeah.
And then there's one other bank, is that it? The government actually?
No, there's actually a huge financial system in China. So there's the central bank, which does more or less the job of any central bank. It provides reserves to the rest of the banking system. There are 4 big commercial banks, which are largely state-owned and definitely state-controlled, which provide credit to other state-owned enterprises and mostly large companies. There's regional banks, there's rural banks, there's credit cooperatives, there's a whole line of things. And there's shadow banks, which are not regulated as banks, but they're doing the work of banks. And they're mostly retail, providing something like a money market deposit and taking the funds and investing it in debt of mostly dubious quality.
So these 4 big banks
Yeah.
essentially can't fail, can they?
It's an interesting question. We were talking about this earlier. I think the way I would ask the question is, what would be the way that they fail? How could one of these banks fail? The short answer is yeah, you're probably right. They're basically state-owned. These banks are used for policy purposes, so probably they won't be allowed to just go bankrupt. But it might be that you would have to work pretty hard to keep them from going bankrupt, because they are to a certain extent. These are international organizations. They may be state-owned, but the Chinese government can't just make everything work, right? They still have to interact with the rest of the world's financial system. So if, for example, bad loans become too big a problem for the large state-owned banks, those assets will eventually have to go somewhere. This was done in the mid-90s with a creation of a number of asset management companies to take bad loans out of the banking system and put them somewhere else. So I don't want to speculate too much, but it could very well be that that could happen again, and there would be some economic consequences to whatever had to be done to clean them up, even if they're state-owned. So let me take the other question, and I can come back. Yeah.
Okay. So the Chinese government recently announced that they would establish a new IT system to even further facilitate the online service for renminbi service.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wonder what's your perspective on its impact on the private sector, like the banking sector, and especially for those banks that stands as the sole primary bank for clearing renminbi.
Yeah. So you're asking about the creation of a new online payment system in renminbi.
The interesting part is that the Hong Kong Bank of China, which is the sole clearing bank for renminbi business, they argued that the payment system wouldn't be going into effect until 2016 because that would largely affect their business. But the government states they would go into effect by next year. So there's a huge debate going on.
Yeah. Well, so I'm not going to predict how it's all going to go, but a couple of observations. At a retail level, the Chinese financial system is relatively constrained, right? So households don't have a lot of options as to where to put their money, right? At some point, sufficiently wealthy and sufficiently sort of sophisticated households can access the shadow banking system or something like that. But there's not a lot of options for the large majority of Chinese depositors. So there is sort of demand, I think, for innovation, and one of the ways that this was met was with, and continues to be, through the creation of a large number of sort of retail financial innovations. So I mean, Alipay, right? This was something that was big. you know, you can get an online money market, what more or less amounts to a money market account, and you can use it to, in a sort of PayPal kind of fashion, send money to people. And this immediately created a political tension, right? Because now with the commercial banking system, because now you've got private online companies setting up what could be eventually significant alternatives to the formal banking sector. So quickly, the intersection between the commercial banking system and the political system becomes relevant, right? The ability to dominate the financial system is a significant source of funds and potentially power, and so alternatives to that are a kind of political challenge. My read, I think, is that the new payment system that they're talking about is kind of trying to create some innovation within a relatively controlled sort of set of circumstances as an alternative to the more challenging private sector alternatives, which entrepreneurs were sort of coming up with. How it will all play out, I am not going to predict.
Okay, we're going to take one more question and then we move to the second part.
Yeah, sure, and I'll be sticking around so we can talk after in an informal way.
Just wanted to ask more of a big picture question about the mirror image of how you frame this. I mean, if this predicted degree of internationalization of the currency happens, what do you see as the ramifications for the U.S. of that?
This is an interesting question. So I personally think that internationalization is going to happen slowly and in a limited way. And from where we are now, it's hard for me to understand how the RMB could significantly displace the dollar. But so your question is let me interpret your question as asking, you know, what if that's wrong, and at some point in the future that does happen? You know, people, I think Americans in particular, tend to view that as a highly negative outcome, right? That the U.S. derives a lot of benefit from derives a lot of benefit from the role of the dollar in the world financial system, and that this would be a major economic loss. Quantifying that is actually difficult, I think, and it's not obvious to me that the U.S. derives more benefits than costs from this arrangement. So if you look back to the height of the financial crisis in late 2008, the problems had sort of jumped from onshore within the US system to offshore, and European banks were having huge amounts of liquidity problems in dollars, right? So European banks were having trouble with not their euro business, but their dollar business. And there was no way for them to generate additional dollars to cover their shortfall. In effect, if you connect the dots, this led directly to the creation of large, eventually unlimited swap lines by which the Federal Reserve could provide dollars to the ECB, who could in turn provide them to the European banking system. This comes at a cost to the Fed, right, and therefore to the United States. Not, again, a difficult to quantify cost, but certainly a political cost, right? It would be difficult for the Fed to have to do that again. If within 10 years of the last crisis, the Fed again found itself having to provide lots of dollars to banks which are operating outside of the US, that would be a big challenge for the Fed. You know, financial costs to the Federal Reserve are tougher to be precise about because it's not really clear. It's not really clear what it means. But it's certain that extending a $500 billion loan to somebody is a financial cost, right? So all of these, I would say, all of the swap lines and all of this sort of role in the international dimensions of the crisis come from the dollar's position as the world reserve currency, right? This wouldn't have happened if there weren't a lot of European banks doing business in dollars. And the reason that they do business in dollars is because of the role of the US dollar in the world financial system. So two conclusions from that, or I won't call them conclusions, two observations or questions which follow from that. One, maybe the US would be better off without it, right? Maybe if there were something else to serve as a world reserve currency, maybe the US would have more freedom to conduct its own economic policy, and maybe we would all be better off. And two, does China actually want that responsibility? China's a developing country with a lot of poor people in it, right? So do they really want to have a world financial system based on their currency, where their ability to conduct their own domestic financial and economic policy has major systemic ramifications for the world monetary system? To me, that seems like not a burden that a developing country would really want to take on. That seems like a lot to ask. So I think, to step it back in conclusion to the highest level, there are issues of politics and sort of national pride and so on, which are wrapped up in these questions of financial institutions and monetary system. I think the debate is confused by this kind of perspective, and I hope that this paper, when it's done, can provide at least the beginnings of a theoretical way to pull the pieces apart and maybe be a little clearer about them. So let me switch here for a little bit. My employer is the Institute for New Economic Thinking, or INET. I run INET's research program on financial stability, and so since I'm here visiting another institution, I thought I would say a little bit about what we do and what I do within INET, and then because you've got your summer fellows here, I'll say a little bit about our programs for graduate students and young economists. So first, a couple words about why INET exists. INET was created sort of, the idea was hatched at the height of the financial crisis and built out over the next couple of years. This is a perspective from today, looking back. The graph is from the BIS, Bank for International Settlements annual report. So the message here is very simple. We had a major crisis with lots of macroeconomic consequences. What do? We lowered interest rates from, here's sort of the advanced countries' interest rates. We lowered interest rates as far as we could. The central banks expanded their assets as much as they could. And this was, central banks, you can see that central banks can immediately lower short-term interest rates. They have a lot of leverage over short-term interest rates, and manage to also bring down long-term interest rates. Okay, so this is what economic theory told us to do. It said lower interest rates, pull down long-term interest rates, and try and get investment started again. Buy up assets, buy up financial assets to encourage borrowing. And it basically didn't really work all that well, right? So here's the euro in the United States. The yellow is the spread of high yield bonds over so let's say the cost of risk, right? And default rates, so another kind of way of thinking about the cost of risk. And in blue is GDP growth. And so at the crisis, the cost of risk was very high, defaults were very high, and GDP growth plummeted, became negative, right? Those are recessions. And so we brought down the cost of risk. We brought it down to extremely low levels, right? Default rates are low, high yield spreads are very low. That's true in both places. But GDP growth has not really returned, right? So the economy, we've pulled all the risk out of the economy, but not managed to really create lots of income, not really managed to create lots of jobs. Things might finally be turning in the United States, not really so much in Europe. These graphs fall short in their ability to show you that this is a very low GDP growth rate. But we know that GDP growth is not at really a level which allows it to generate income, and not really at a level which allows it to which allows people to recover the lost income from the recession. So INET's observation, INET's position in this is to say that part of what happened here is that economics, the discipline which should have been the intellectual source of ideas about what to do about a crisis like this, also had a crisis at the same moment as the financial crisis. That economics didn't have the tools, didn't have the ideas, didn't have the ways of thinking about the world which would have provided the basis for a comprehensive and adequate response to the crisis. There were some people who had very good ideas and very helpful ideas, but those ideas were fairly systematically pushed out of the mainstream, and those voices were not well heard during the crisis. So INET's idea was to try to change that by promoting the work of these marginalized voices, at least in the initial conception, really focused on finance and macroeconomics and monetary economics, since then expanding also into other questions not strictly related to finance. So that we can have, in the future, we can have an economics discipline with more tools and better tools and a greater ability to respond to the practical demands presented to us by events. We are called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, but I think it's important to say that we don't have too rigid an idea of what we mean by that term. We're not trying to replace an old orthodoxy with a new orthodoxy. And so I would say instead we're for pluralism, the idea that in the field of economics, many ideas and many different ways of thinking are in general needed because questions are complex and because concrete, narrow, specific final answers are in general not available. For pragmatism, because theory for theory's sake is certainly one of the things that led to our having a macroeconomics and a financial economics, which were incapable of dealing with the realities of the crisis of 2008. And for debate, in the sense that we tried to be intellectually serious insofar as ideas can be proven wrong, and if you're so certain about your ideas that you can't debate them in good faith, then there's not too much hope of progress. And sometimes by new economic thinking, we actually mean old economic thinking, and I think I tried to demonstrate that in my talk before, that a lot of the perspective for questions, very, very current questions like the internationalization of the renminbi, can find, if not specific answers, at least helpful perspectives in economists who have gone before, but who have not necessarily received the full attention of the discipline. That characterization is certainly not true of Keynes, although one can find different things in Keynes than the discipline mostly adopted. But Minsky, Kindleberger, and Hawtrey are three economists whom I find very useful and completely relevant, but who are essentially neglected by the mainstream of the discipline. Old economic thinking often needs updating for modern institutions. As the financial system changes, the logic of older ideas about the financial system need to be suitably updated. And so that is sort of the big picture of INET's work. My role within INET is to coordinate our research program on financial stability, which involves working with economists within INET and a large network of economists at other institutions, central banks, universities, other think tank type of places in Europe, in China, in Latin America, and across North America and the UK. We are developing some projects now in India as well. I have not, that has not yet fallen into my responsibility, but INET is my point is that INET is working hard to be a global institution. So the research program is developed into several projects, and so really, this is just to give you an idea. Each of these are sort of full-fledged research projects about which we could talk for a long time. Central banking, right? So we have a new financial system in the last 30 years, more global, faster moving, more integrated with the real economy, a greater diversity of instruments, a greater diversity of kinds of institutions involved in the financial system. So how should this be regulated? Our frameworks for monetary policy often date back 50 years before we had a lot of this stuff. So how should we think about monetary policy in 2014, post-crisis, and post this several decades of innovation? when maybe the rules have changed, or maybe the rules need to be adapted. Maybe the instruments need to be changed, the way that the central bank interacts with the financial system. The status or role of central banks in societies has also changed. There was a time when Federal Reserve policymaking was not front page news. That is very much the case today for the Fed, for the ECB, for the Bank of Japan. All of these central banks have moved themselves into a significantly changed position in the world. But a central bank is not a representative institution. The head of the central bank is appointed. The bureaucracy in the central bank is sort of mostly people who come up through the system. So in a democratic society, are we okay with central banks working the way that they are, and whose interests are they actually working for? Maybe that is something that needs to be thought through again. Another project is on debt and demography. We can talk about credit aggregates, right? The stock of mortgages in the United States. But how does that, who is holding those mortgages, right? There were significant social consequences to the distribution of mortgage lending in the United States in the housing bubble and crisis related to the whole sort of process that led to this excess of mortgage credit. So we have a systematic project to look at the relationship between debt and demography in a number of countries, asking what segments of the population are bearing a country's debt, and what are the implications for this in terms of as that debt gets paid off, who gets to accumulate the wealth in that country over time, and what might that mean for growth and for public finances, pension finance, and that sort of thing. Chinese financial system I've talked about. Shadow banking system is so we talk about the Western. We have a project on the U.S. shadow banking system, essentially a set of financial innovations over the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then which contributed significantly to the crisis of 2008. Our purpose is to say, these innovations certainly had a role to play in the crisis, but it's not clear that there is anything wrong with the ideas in themselves. How does this system work? How did it break? Could it be run safely? And what might you need to do in order to make it work? And so we have a paper out on that and another one coming. And so these four are all sort of, I think of them as kind of topical projects. We also have some sort of methodological projects. Stock flow consistent modeling is sort of a new approach to, it's not that new, but it hasn't been developed sufficiently yet. An approach to macroeconomic modeling which carefully integrates credit flows and financial flows into models of real economic activity. And so the people who are doing this work for us have reasonably complete financial and real economic models for Ireland and Iceland, obviously two countries significantly affected by the crisis. And so this, building credit into the models lets you reach a different kind of set of conclusions about the consequences of the crisis, about what kind of policy should be used in order to control the buildup of credit, that sort of thing. Network models of the financial system, so finding ways to measure and model and understand how financial institutions are related to each other. If you imagine, as Lehman failed during the crisis here, it turned out that a lot of smaller institutions were counterparties to Lehman, and so they were also affected in a way that was difficult to predict or difficult to understand a priori. So there's a body of mathematical theory and increasingly regulatory data, which lets us maybe say something about the structure of the financial system and how these interconnections work. This might have something to say about systemic risk and the resiliency of the system and how you might prevent a small crisis from becoming a system-wide crisis. And agent-based economic modeling is something that's been around for a long time without really having sort of reached a level of maturity that it could see a lot of policy use and sort of gain a real and secure foothold in the economic debate. INET is supporting a number of these projects on the notion that somebody really ought to settle this once and for all. Are these things going to be useful, or maybe are they not? You know, I guess to characterize agent-based models, you would say that they depend highly on simulation and on behavioral rules instead of depending highly on analytical solutions and assumptions, strong assumptions of rationality. Right. So that's my work, is to basically coordinate these and a couple other projects and the people working on them, and try to get you know, some concrete results out of these lines of research, and push the ideas to see how far they can be taken. INET has a broad range of activities, and so one of the other sets of things that we're doing is a lot of engagement directly with young economists. The Young Scholars Initiative is the name of the project, mostly focused on economics students at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD level. So I call this the life cycle theory of disciplinary change. The point is that there are only really a few moments in the life of an economist where they might really want to change their course from orthodox economic thinking to non-orthodox or less orthodox economic thinking. And the time when they're deciding what to write their dissertation about, their PhD dissertation about, is one of the big ones. So we view engagement with economic students as a central opportunity in promoting change in the economics discipline more generally. So we have a number of projects related, you know, sort of to engage directly with this with this population. Reading groups on a number of different topics to sort of provide a space for discussion and finding other people who are interested in topics which, you know, an average economics PhD student or master's student at their home institution might not really be able to find anyone who wants to talk about complexity economics or shadow banking. So we provide ways for those people to find each other and sort of get into the debate. Conferences, there's an incomplete sentence there. We're organizing a conference this November at the Dutch Central Bank in collaboration with the young professional organization of economists within the central bank. So trying to reach people who've sort of already moved into a policy world where they're having an effect on how things are working, and sort of ask some of these big questions about how central banks should work, ask them in the open environment of a bunch of graduate students and a bunch of young people working at the central bank. We do some mini schools, so these are like 4-day or 3-day or 4-day courses on topics which you might not have anything on at your home institution. We have a Coursera course which is free and which you can check out on money and banking. It's a viewpoint on the monetary system. It's very complementary to what I've been talking about here, but not something you're likely to find in most money and banking classes at the undergraduate or master's level in most institutions. And we're trying to build out a portfolio of those kinds of classes to cover topics which are less common in economics programs. And so the YSI is also kind of a way to start bringing graduate students into the other things that INET is doing, in particular mentoring type of things, where we can connect a PhD student with a supervisor, dissertation supervisor or advisor from one of our research projects. So trying to build a network of people who want to think about these kinds of things and get connected with a community that is also doing the same. And if you want to check it out, ysicommons.ning.com is the little social networking platform that they built out, which is a good way to find out what's current. And so this is just to give you a sense. This is from my trip to China last month. we're at a little bookstore called the Shanghai Jifeng Bookstore. This is Perry Merling, my professor and colleague at INET. And this is a group of Shanghai students who are taking this money and banking course right now, which Perry is running. The point of the picture is just to show you that we're sort of engaging, we're trying to engage people at a handshake kind of level. So these guys organized a little meetup in this bookstore, and he went and talked to them for an hour and answered questions. And we view the whole project as kind of a one person at a time sort of thing. So both global and personal. And I hope it works. So there you go. Thank you for having me.